Montana Territory, 1871. The wind carried the last cry of winter as Penelope Darden stood alone outside her cabin, her black dress stiff in the cold, her hands raw from chopping wood. Her husband had died in the war, not the recent Indian conflicts, but the one back east, the one they called the war between the states. He had ridden off in a blue coat 6 years ago and came back in a pine box 4 years later, nothing but bones and a folded flag. She had buried him herself, with the pastor from Fort Benton saying a few words that sounded too clean for what she had lost. Now it was just her and her son, Henry, 5 years old, and her daughter, Hope, barely 3. The land was rough but familiar, 30 acres of pine and rock and stubborn grass, with a cabin her husband built when they were newlyweds. It had been their fresh start, their dream. Now it was a place she was barely holding together. Penelope was not built for begging, but the winter had thinned the pantry, and a wheel had snapped off the wagon axle last week. She had gone to town for flour and nails, trading her last quilt for credit, and left with a warning from the storekeep. "Snow's coming fast, you got no man. Get one or get out." She didn't answer him. She just took the flour and walked back into the wind. It was 2 days after that when she first saw him. He came riding slow up the trail from the south, a tall man on a bay gelding, with a duster the color of dry earth and a rifle strapped across his saddle. He dismounted like he had been riding for days, boots crunching the frost as he approached. Penelope stepped out onto the porch, one hand on the shotgun leaning by the door. "You lost?" she asked. He took off his hat, revealing dark hair and tired green eyes. "No, ma'am, looking for work, actually. Someone in town said a widow out here needed help." Her heart kicked. She kept her voice even. "And you figured that was me?" He nodded once. "Only cabin between town and the ridge, name's Callum Mercer." She studied him. He looked about 30, maybe a year or two more, with the kind of face that had known both hard roads and quiet kindness. He did not look like a man searching for easy coin. "I don't have money," she said. "I'm not asking for any," Callum said. "Just a place to sleep and something to do with my hands, and if you let me stay a while, I'll get your axle fixed, see to your fences. You've got coyotes bold enough to come near the chickens." "How do you know that?" He glanced toward the coop. "Tracks in the snow, small ones, young, hungry." Penelope hesitated. She didn't like trusting strangers, but she liked the idea of losing her livestock even less. "Fine," she said. "You sleep in the barn, you earn your keep." He nodded again. "That suits me." Callum worked like a man with something to prove. By the second day, the wagon was fixed. By the fourth, he had patched the east fence and chopped enough wood to last through a second winter. He never asked questions, never got in her way. He was kind to the children without being soft. Henry followed him like a shadow, asking about horses and prairie dogs, while Hope sat on the porch with her doll, watching him with wide eyes. One night after the children had gone to sleep, Penelope brought him a plate of stew and stood watching him eat by the fire. "You fight in the war?" she asked quietly. Callum paused, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am, cavalry. Union. Texas, so no." She stiffened, but he didn't flinch. "I was 17. My brothers went. I followed." He set the plate down. "I'm not proud of all of it, but I try to make good now." Penelope looked at the fire, then back at him. "My husband died at Cold Harbor." Callum nodded, not saying sorry, just letting her have the space. "You got a wife somewhere?" she asked. "No." "Why not?" He looked at her steady. "Never met one I wanted to stand beside, not until now." Her breath caught. She turned away, not ready to hear that, not ready to feel anything again, but the words stayed with her through the night. A week passed, then 2. One morning, Hope wandered out too far from the cabin. Penelope had turned her back for just a moment to pull bread from the oven. When she looked up, her daughter was gone. She screamed her name until her throat burned. Henry cried beside her. Callum was already on his horse. "She is small," he said. "She won't have gone far." He rode south toward the trees, calling gently, looking for small footprints. Penelope followed on foot, her dress catching on branches, her heart a hammer in her chest. It was nearly dusk when Callum found her Hope, curled beneath a brush of pine, shivering but safe. He lifted her into his arms and wrapped her in his coat. When he brought her back, Penelope fell to her knees, pulling her daughter close. Then she looked up at him, tears streaking her face. "Thank you," she whispered. He crouched beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder, firm and warm. "I'll stand where he cannot," Callum said, his voice low but sure, "beside you if you let me." She looked into his eyes, and this time she did not turn away. The next morning, when she brought him coffee, she smiled. And this time he smiled back. The frost had lifted for a time. The creek behind the cabin ran clear again, and the earth softened enough for the mule to till the garden. Callum adjusted the harness and watched Penelope ease seedlings into the dirt. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and her fingernails were dark with soil. She didn't speak, just pressed the roots down with care, like she was offering the land a quiet promise. "You always plant this early?" Callum asked, stepping over a ridge of turned earth. Penelope shook her head, wiping her brow with the back of her wrist. "Only when the ground says it's ready. Last year I waited too long, lost half the beans to hail." Callum nodded, settling beside her. He pulled a small sack from his coat and handed it over. "Picked these up from a fur trader headed north, said they're Cherokee squash, thought you might make use of them." She looked at the seeds, then at him. "You didn't have to bring anything?" "I know," he said. "Still did." Penelope took the sack and ran her thumb over the rough fabric. She didn't smile, but her voice softened. "Thank you." Hope came toddling over then, her bonnet askew and a stick clutched in her hand like a sword. She plopped herself down beside Callum without a word, content to dig at the dirt near his boot. He glanced at Penelope. "She always this quiet?" "She talks when she has something worth saying," Penelope replied. "Otherwise she listens. She gets that from you." Penelope didn't answer. A robin landed nearby and pecked at the earth. The wind stirred the pine above them, and for a while they planted in silence. Later, as dusk settled, Penelope poured water into the basin and unpinned her braid. The children were asleep, Henry curled up with his wooden horse, and Hope tucked beneath a quilt stitched from old shirts. Callum was outside, mending a broken stirrup with thread and care. She stepped onto the porch with a shawl over her shoulders. Callum didn't turn, but his hand paused. "I was thinking," she said quietly, "of taking in a few hens from the widow Simmons. She's heading back east, can't keep them for the journey." He kept his gaze on the leather. "You think they'll winter well out here, if I build the coop tall enough and line it with straw?" "It'd help with eggs come spring," he nodded. "I can help with the framing. There's good pine west of the ridge." She stepped down and leaned against the post. "You always this willing to work for things that aren't yours?" Callum looked up at her, eyes steady. "I don't see it that way." No, he said. "When you build something with your hands, you belong to it same as it belongs to you." Penelope studied him for a long moment. "You speak like someone who lost something." "I have," he said. "Enough to know what's worth holding on to now." She didn't press. She nodded once and turned to go back inside. The next morning, Callum brought in a bundle of cedar boughs and set them near the hearth. He didn't say it was for her headaches or the way her shoulders stiffened after too many hours bent over the washboard. He just left them there, and she lit them later when the children were napping and the wind was sharp again. That afternoon, Henry followed Callum down to the creek. Penelope watched from the slope as her boy took careful steps behind the man, mimicking how he crouched to track a rabbit trail in the damp earth. When they returned, Henry's boots were soaked and his cheeks ruddy, but he carried a small bundle of wild onions in his palm like treasure. That night, Penelope added them to the stew. Callum didn't comment, but he finished his bowl and looked to her when she stood to gather the dishes. "You ever think of leaving this place?" he asked as she passed. She paused. "I did once, right after he died. Stood outside with the children in my arms and thought about walking. Didn't know where, just away. And I stayed." She looked down at her hands. "There wasn't anywhere that felt more mine than this land, even in the grief." Callum nodded. "You made it more than his." She didn't reply, but her gaze lingered on his face longer than it had before. She gathered the bowls and stepped into the kitchen. The days warmed. Snowmelt filled the lower fields. One morning, Penelope found a small wooden figure on the porch rail, a horse, carved with care. She picked it up, ran her thumb over its back, and glanced toward the barn. Callum was inside, brushing down the gelding. She didn't speak of the carving. But that night, she left a folded shirt near the barn door, one of her husband's, stitched clean and mended at the cuffs. Neither mentioned the offerings. But something settled between them, quiet and certain. The first real thunderstorm of spring came in the night, waking Penelope with the kind of suddenness that left her heart racing. Rain battered the roof in heavy sheets, and the wind screamed down the chimney like a voice trying to be remembered. She lit the lamp low and checked the children, both still curled beneath Quilt's safe, unbothered. When she turned from their room, Callum was on the far side of the parlor, barefoot, holding a tin basin to catch a new leak from the ceiling. She crossed the room, took another basin from the shelf, and set it beneath a slow drip by the hearth. "You always sleep that light?" she asked. He didn't look over. "Storms keep me up, always have," she nodded, folding her arms against the chill. "We used to get them worse when I was little. Lightning split a cottonwood near our house once, burned straight to the roots." "Where was that?" "North Mississippi, near a place called Saltillo. My father taught school in a church that had no windows." Callum leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "And you?" "You ever teach?" She shook her head. "No time for it. My mother died before I was grown. I raised my brothers, got married young. We came west as soon as we could." He watched her for a while, his face unreadable in the flickering lamp glow. Then he said, "I used to think I'd end up a preacher." She raised an eyebrow. I had the voice for it, back then." He glanced down. "Turns out I couldn't carry other people's sins. Barely managed my own." Penelope looked at him, trying to picture that version, clean-shaved, standing behind a pulpit, telling weary folks what God wanted from them. It didn't fit. He was too quiet, too observant. She imagined he listened more than he spoke even then. "You don't talk like other men," she said. "What kind of men do I talk like?" "The kind that think before they open their mouths." He gave a soft chuckle, low and brief, and looked toward the window. "That keeps me out of trouble most days." She stepped nearer to the fire, then reached for the kettle. "I can make coffee if you've lost sleep already." "I'd take it," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "if it's not too much trouble. You've patched this place more times than I can count." "A cup's the least I owe." She poured water and set the kettle to the flames. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It felt like the kind that comes after hard labor, when words aren't needed to prove anything. After a while he said, "Henry asked if I'd teach him to fish." She glanced over. "You know where?" "There's a bend 2 miles east. Saw it last week. Shallow, but the trout run through there if the rains are good." She nodded. "He's never held a rod. His daddy was going to teach him, but..." She trailed off, not from sadness, but because there was nothing else to say. That chapter had ended, only the children carried its unfinished lines. "I'll show him," Callum said. "If that's all right, I'd be grateful. He needs someone steady." He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. The kettle hissed, and she poured 2 mugs, handing one to him. They drank by the fire, not speaking again until the storm rolled eastward and the wind softened to a hush. When she finally stood to return to bed, she paused just before the hallway. "You've been here near 2 months," she said, not turning around. "That barn's not made for sleeping through storms." Wasn't going to say anything. "I know." She waited, and he didn't move, just watched her in the quiet. "You can take the corner room," she said at last. "I cleared it when my brother visited years back. Door locks from the inside." "Penelope, I know what I'm saying," she said, finally facing him, "and what I'm not." He stood carefully, not rushing. "I'll keep the door shut, and I'll be gone before the children wake." She nodded once, then disappeared down the hall. The next morning, Henry was bouncing at the edge of the porch, fishing poles slung over his shoulder like a rifle. Callum stepped from the barn with a tackle box in one hand, his boots already damp from the grass, and met the boy with a nod. Penelope watched from the kitchen window, her hands buried in flour, the smell of rising dough thick in the warm air. Hope sat beneath the table with a rag doll, humming something tuneless. By the time the sun crested the ridge, the men were gone down the trail, and Penelope felt the strangest thing bloom in her chest, something like quiet gladness, but older, steadier. It didn't ask for anything. It just stayed. That evening, Henry returned with swollen cheeks from sun and laughter, holding up 2 trout like trophies. Callum said nothing at all, just handed over the fish and stepped aside. Penelope took them both and cleaned them behind the cabin, her hands practiced, her mind elsewhere. After the children had gone to bed, she found Callum seated on the back steps, oiling the blade of his knife. She sat beside him, not speaking. The day's heat still clung to the wood beneath them, and crickets sang from the tall grass. "I thought love was something loud," she said after a while. "Like music or wind through a door you forgot to latch," he looked at her. "And now I think it's this." Callum set the knife aside. "What is this?" She turned to him, eyes steady. "A man doing what he says he will, standing where someone else can't." He didn't reach for her. "He didn't need to. I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I know." Then she leaned into his shoulder and he let her, and the night wrapped around them like a thing long promised. The first calf arrived in late April, born breech and near silent in the early hours before sunrise. Penelope found Callum already in the pasture, sleeves rolled, knees sunk into the mud, both hands steady as he coaxed the calf free with a gentleness that seemed to belong more to a different kind of man. The mother cow groaned low, flanks trembling, but didn't bolt. When it was done, the calf lay blinking under the gray sky, slick with afterbirth and already reaching for its first breath. Penelope didn't speak. She brought him a bucket of water, set it down beside him, and watched as he rubbed the calf down with burlap, slow and sure, like it was something sacred. By the time the sun crested the ridge, the calf was on its feet and wobbling toward its mother. Callum stood, wiped his hands on his trousers, and let out a breath like he'd been holding it since the night before. Penelope handed him the water. "You done that before?" He drank deep, then nodded. "My uncle raised cattle in the Panhandle. Didn't matter if it was midnight or a snowstorm, if a cow was calving, you showed up." She studied his face. There was mud on his cheek and his hair stuck to his forehead. He looked worn through, but not weary. "Henry's been asking about the branding iron," she said. "Says he wants to mark one himself." "You think he's ready?" Callum asked. "I think he wants to be. That's a start." They walked back together, boots heavy with damp earth. Hope met them by the porch, still in her nightdress, hugging a crocus wrapped in twine. Penelope crouched to take it, brushing a curl from the child's cheek. "She said it was for the baby cow," Callum murmured. Penelope looked up at him. "She listens more than she lets on." That afternoon, while the children napped, Penelope hauled the sewing basket out to the porch and began patching the hem of her work skirt. Callum sanded a length of pine a few feet away, preparing planks for the new chicken coop. Neither of them spoke for a long while, but the quiet had taken on a different shape these past weeks, not empty, but filled with something unspoken, steady. "Do you miss Texas?" she asked at last, not looking up from her stitching. "I miss my mother's voice," he said. "She used to sing while she shelled peas, nothing fancy, just old folk songs, sounded like home." Penelope tied off her thread. "Mine used to hum when she was angry. You could hear her, soft as anything, but you knew better than to speak." Callum smiled, eyes on the wood grain. "Funny how it's the little things that stay. You ever think of going back?" He shook his head. "There's nothing left there for me. My oldest brother's buried near the old fort, and the rest scattered after the war ended." Penelope set her mending aside. "Do you ever think about having something again, a home, land of your own?" He looked at her then, saw the question she hadn't voiced. "I've thought about it more lately," he said. "But not just because of the land." She didn't answer, just gathered her things and stood. But before she stepped inside, she paused. "I've been thinking too." One evening, a few days later, Callum took Henry out behind the barn with the branding iron. Penelope stood just inside the doorway, arms crossed and lips pressed tight, not interfering. She watched as Callum showed the boy how to hold the iron, how to wait until the calf was steady, how to press it quick and sure so it marked clean without burning too deep. Henry's hands trembled, but he followed every word. Afterward, he ran up to the house, face flushed with pride, and shouted that he'd done it, that he'd really done it. Penelope tousled his hair and sent him to wash before supper. Callum came in later, pulling off his gloves and hanging them by the stove. She poured him a cup of chicory and handed it over without a word. He leaned against the wall near the fire. "You did right by him, you know." "I try," she said. "Some days it feels like guessing." "Still," he said, He trusts you. That's not something boys do easy. Penelope looked at him over the rim of her cup. He trusts you too. Callum set his cup down. I want to ask you something. Her back straightened, but she didn't look away. I won't if it's too soon, he added, but I want to say it clean. She waited. I'd like to stay, he said. Not as a hand, not out in the barn. I want to build onto the house, put down something real with you if you'll have me. Penelope's breath caught in her throat. She looked down at her hands, rough from work, the same hands that had buried a husband and held 2 children through winters and sickness and silence. Then she looked back at the man before her, the one who had mended more than fences, who had never asked for more than he'd earned. I don't know what comes next, she said. I've only ever been one kind of wife. You don't need to be anything but yourself. She stepped forward slowly and rested her hand in his. His fingers closed over hers like they'd always belonged there. That room you took, she said softly. You won't need to lock it anymore. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just leaned his forehead to hers, and for the first time in years she let herself lean back. The fire crackled behind them, and outside the window, the first stars rose over the pasture where the calf slept beside its mother, the world beginning again in the quietest of ways. By the time the wild columbine bloomed at the edge of the tree line, Callum's things were folded into a carved cedar chest in the corner room. The children had taken to his presence, like it had always been so Hope slipping her small hand into his without thought, and Henry checking the coop each morning before his boots were tied, just to make sure it had been built right. The addition to the cabin began the day the creek swelled from spring runoff. Callum measured beams with a steady eye, and Penelope held the level while Henry passed nails from a tin pail. The children stayed near while they worked, playing quietly in the shade of the porch. Hope had taken to stringing together tiny garlands of dandelion and pine needles, her tongue tucked in concentration. She draped one over Callum's shoulder as he hammered. He didn't flinch. Am I the mule today, then? She says it's a crown, Penelope said, brushing sawdust from her wrist. And you're not allowed to take it off until the sun sets. He left it there until dusk. That night, Penelope stood washing her hands in the basin after supper, sleeves damp to the elbow. Callum leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her work. The fire behind him had burned low, throwing long shadows across the floor. You ever think about what you'd do if you didn't have to keep the farm going? He asked. She dried her hands on a scrap of linen. I don't think like that. It's not about what I'd do if I didn't have to, it's about doing it anyway. I know, he said, voice quieter now, but I wonder sometimes if you ever wanted something that wasn't tied to survival. She looked at him for a long moment before answering. I used to draw back when I was a girl. Faces, mostly. I'd sit near the window and sketch people from memory. He stepped forward. You still have them? No, she said, shaking her head. They burned with my parents' house before the war pushed us west. He didn't speak for a moment, just reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I've been carrying this since you let me in. Found it caught under the floorboard in the corner room. She took it slowly. It was yellowed and creased, but the lines were her mother's face, sketched in charcoal, the eyes unfinished but unmistakable. Penelope ran her thumb over the edge. I thought this was gone. I figured it was worth saving. She looked up at him, eyes shining with something deeper than surprise. Why didn't you show me sooner? Didn't want to bring up something painful before you were ready. She stepped forward and pressed her hand to his chest. I'm ready now. They married on a clear morning in early May, beneath the cottonwoods that lined the western edge of the pasture. The pastor came from Fort Benton, same as before, but this time the words he spoke didn't feel clean, they felt lived in. Henry wore his father's old boots, shined to a polish, and Hope carried a basket of apple blossoms she scattered with great ceremony. Penelope wore a dress she'd made from muslin bought the previous fall, dyed with walnut husks until it turned the color of river stone. Callum shaved for the first time in months. His hands didn't shake when he took hers. Afterward, they shared cornbread and smoked trout at a long table set beneath the sky. The neighbors came with jars of pickled beans and tins of dried apples, and someone brought a fiddle that played until the stars came out. Callum didn't dance, but he stood with hope in his arms and swayed at the edge of the circle while Penelope laughed with her hair falling loose. That night, when the house was quiet again and the children asleep, they stood together on the porch. The moon was full, casting a silver wash across the field. Penelope leaned into his side, her hand resting just below his ribs. "I never thought I'd have this again," she said softly. "You didn't just have it," he answered. "You rebuilt it piece by piece. And you," he looked out across the land. "I spent years not knowing what I was meant for. Turns out it was this. A woman with a spine of iron and a patch of soil that grows more than it takes." She smiled into his shoulder. "You're poetic when the moon's high. I'm honest when I'm full." He kissed her then, slow and without urgency, like nothing in the world needed rushing anymore. Summer came with bees in the clover and a second calf born strong. The addition to the cabin held against the first storm, and Henry carved his name into a beam with Callum's old knife. Hope planted nasturtiums in a row along the porch, and they bloomed bright and wild. Penelope drew again. Not often, but when the light came through the window just right, she'd take a scrap of paper and sketch her children, or the curve of Callum's wrist as he mended tack, or the way the hills folded into each other beyond the trees. They grew older in peace. Not without work, not without the stubbornness of seasons and soil, but with a kind of contentment that came from knowing the worst was past, and the rest was theirs to make. And every night when the lamp was turned low and the wind curled soft against the windows, they lay side by side, her head on his chest, his hand at the small of her back, and knew they had built something unshakable together.